Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Welcome back to the Ask Historians podcast. I'm user SteelCan909, and this time it's a little bit different because I'm actually talking about a subject I'm supposed to know something about. I'm joined here I'll go ahead and let him introduce himself actually.
Hi, my name is Saul. I'm user thefeckamIdoing, and I'm a very proud member of the Ask Historians community. And I also run a regular podcast called The Story of London, which is a perhaps insane attempt to tell the narrative history of London as it happened in weekly installments.
And the reason that I mentioned that it's something I should know something about is that the origins of London as a continuously inhabited settlement are in my own area of expertise, which is in the early medieval Anglo-Saxon period. So why don't we just kind of go ahead and jump on in with that? What can you tell us about the origins of London with the Roman settlement and the later resettlement of the site by the Anglo-Saxons, the early English, whatever your terminology is?
Yeah, my pleasure. I think for me, I very somewhat, I suppose, controversially feel there are four versions of London, and the first two, the Roman versions, I don't connect to the early medieval Anglo-Saxon community. Partly because Londinium 1.0, the original legionary crossing point, was destroyed within a few decades by Boadicea. Londinium 2.0 was a completely different beast. It was Nero's conception. It was meant and it was designed to be the capital of Britannia, and so it was built from scratch. No need to, the previous regime's desire to impress native tribes, which caused them to put their headquarters in Colchester. That's all gone now. Let's just make our own place for ourselves. And whereas there's a few thematic elements you see between Londinium and what was to become London, I don't feel there's a continuous thing, because round about 450, Londinium was reduced to a ruin, and it stayed like that for several centuries. It was uninhabited, it was just a wreck. The Anglo-Saxon, early medieval settlement downriver, on where today's Covent Garden is, going towards Trafalgar Square, Ludunwic or Ludunwic, was separate, London 3.0. And there was no connect between the two. And indeed, until Alfred the Great decided to move that community behind the walls that were probably built during the reign of Commodus. But the Roman walls were literally all that remained of Londinium in any sensible form. And so when Alfred moved it to the Roman ruins, thus we have our city of London. So there's no direct, for me, there is no direct correlation between, apart from physical location, between Londinium, the Roman city, and what became London as we know it today. So I do insist on a bit of a split between the two. There are some elements that do come in, it being a centre of commerce, which I'll talk about, but fundamentally, for about 400 years, Londinium was a wreck. And so we look to Londonburg to start seeing the development of what would become London. Londonwic, which would become London.
Well, before we dive into that, can you tell us a little bit about why London became a wreck, or why Londinium became a wreck? Because I know with my own area of interest in research, there's a we can talk about the broader context of economic decline in the late Roman Empire in Britain, the deurbanization process, economic despecialization that happens to there. Can you kind of unwrap that for us a little bit and talk about why does London, or excuse me, Londinium cease to be? It's not often that cities just stop.
Yes, and it didn't just stop. It was a long process, and by this point, it's worth saying that for the latter part of its life, Londinium was actually called Augusta, and it even changed the name, and they were very happy to be Augusta. But I think it was the golden era for me, the height of it. It came in two stages. First of all, as the Romans pushed up into Britannia, Londinium, it was a better location than Colchester because it had sea access. And all the supplies for the legions came in from the empire into Londinium stocks. It was too much for the state to actually run, and they basically, it's like a public-private enterprise. A lot of enterprising people in Londinium made a lot of money shipping goods in. So it began to grow, but it kind of reached its height for me in the 320s, 340s. Constantine, who had been first proclaimed emperor up in York, he never forgot Britannia's support of him, and between 320 and 340 starts lavishing the city. From that point on, it begins to decline, I think, more politically as well as the economic declines that goes on. I mean, between about 365 to 410, it's in and out of the empire several times without. I never went too much into this one because it gets very complex, but it does split in and out. This whole idea of the Romans got up and left, it left several times voluntarily. Um, we know by the 370s the economy is collapsing, and for Britannia it was worse because whereas there wasn't as much foreign invasion or tribal invasion, their markets were being devastated and trade was being devastated. So capital was being devastated. So that eroded the marketplaces, eroded the the docks, which begin to fall into disrepute. We start seeing malaise in the public buildings as well. There was, we know there was one, there was a couple of houses. I remember the researcher was fascinated by this in the southeast of Londinium. There was a community about 4 or 5 houses where people seemed to be living towards the end, life high on the hog, lots of luxuries, throwing the denarii around. There seems to be like a last huzzah, a last bastion of rich folks living out there. And then we have a reference to a church synod in 429 to do with Pelagius. But by 450, it's fair to say that it had eroded. And I think it had eroded due to the reason why it wasn't immediately resettled is the same reason why it was eroded, because you need a certain amount of manpower to repair things. You need a certain amount of people to keep infrastructure afloat. And as infrastructure begins to fall, the repairs become too much, and there's no incentive, especially as we see the collapse in coins and the collapse in the monetary system and all of that. There's no incentive for anybody to spend 3 weeks clearing that road or rebuilding that house or doing whatever. So it's kind of a drip feed, but it sort of feeds in on itself with everything else that was going on everywhere else. And so you eventually just see Londinium dies a quite sad death. It wasn't alone in that. There were plenty of other places. It's just interesting that it remained as a ruin. And then for the Anglo-Saxons, there's no incentive to clear it because when Ludunwic starts up, you need a lot of manpower to repair what's going on behind those walls. I mean, if you've got an old Roman villa and you want to fix the roof, that's fine. But after a few years, if you want to fix the roof, you've got to start working on the walls. And if you want to fix the walls, you've got to start working on the weakened foundations. That's a lot of work, and that's right across it. So it's far easier to nick some stones, take it a mile down the river, help set up something down here. So this is where it kind of became a ruin like you'd see in the Middle East or in North Africa, or in ancient, in Greece, a ruined site. And I think it just allowed itself to just, nature took over, and it remained a liminal space for the longest time.
That's interesting. The situation that you have broadly in, I know, the northern parts of the Roman Empire is this period of economic decline and contraction. It's not limited to Britain, but also in Gaul and other parts of the empire. Obviously, as they start getting lopped off the empire, they start having more and more problems. But the situation in England, to call it England as opposed to Britannia due to the influx of Germanic peoples, is very different because the Roman culture didn't really survive in England in the same way that it did in Gaul or Italy or Spain and so on. I think you can argue that somewhere like North Africa is more comparable, where the existing Roman culture just kind of goes away in a way that it didn't in other parts of Europe. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that process as we start going in. I know this is a little bit more than just the city of
Yeah.
London,
Well,
but
it's
that,
fine because this is where the idea of what would become Ludunwic is born, the actual change in culture and that assimilation is actually very important in the creation of the wick, the market. Um, because what you start seeing then is the influx of the Germanics. But what we're talking about here is Saxon, Jutes, Franks, Britons,
yeah,
Frisians.
using the word Germanic as a very
Yeah, yeah.
shorthand.
But when they all came in. It was a slow drip, and I will say I don't actually believe in the whole mythic idea of Hengist and his huge armies, and the whole Arthurian mythos that comes in from that. When you look at the early Germanic settlers, if you look at the actual houses they built, these were hovels. These were refugees. On the whole, there was conflict with the native Britons, but it was a very low intensity war. I think, if you look at the number of battles over the amount of time, you can see it's very slow. It's an erosion. I think other things as well, around about the 540s, you've got the Great Mortality, the plague, which seems to have had a bigger impact on the native Briton culture and the native Britons. Um, and you've also got a degree of, some researchers suggested there was an element of climate change. So it became less fertile over towards the east of the country. So you see some of the native Britons already moving towards the west. And that's sort of the migration towards, say, Cornwall or Wales or Strathclyde. But then add to that, as much as many went, as many stayed. And there wasn't this whole them and us mentality we see later on. There's loads of Britons stayed. And so what you start seeing then is the emergence of, ruling classes. You've got, and especially for London, because you've got Kent, so you've got the Jutes coming in large numbers. North of it, you've got the Angles, you've got the Saxons setting up, you've got Britannics coming in. And so what you end up is a sort of a confluence place where it's a natural meeting point between several different groups, and that includes, because you had Essex really being the first organised kingdom, and you've got Kent, then you've got Essex, then you've got what became Sussex, and then eventually Wessex. As they start spreading out, and there's a whole separate creation sort of process with the Angles up in Mercia, which was far more based on assimilation as opposed to conquest and integration. So it's a real, obviously, as you know, it's an incredibly confusing and fluid stuff where every discovery gives us a new revelation. But it was in between all of this that originally under Essex, but not in any kind of big flag waving way. That Londominium was started up as a place where people could trade, because this is in the days before there was any kind of currency. So it was a barter system, or a system working on payment and food, and that's where the Wick began.
Was Londominium one of the Emporia?
It became an emporia when it first started. It definitely wasn't. There's a lovely moment when the story goes that during the reign of Ethelbert of Kent, and along comes the first great Christian missionary journey to this land, and London was chosen because London was near the location of Londinium, was chosen to be the great seat of Christian power. Unfortunately for London, the king at the time was a pagan called Schled, and Schled of Essex was not going to allow the Christians set up in his wick. So they ended up being based in Canterbury under Kent. And it's like, poo, that would have changed so much if London had been the centre. But it started off as a market. It became an emporium when Mercia took over. And that's the thing, I think, this is from a lot of London histories. By the 600s, you start seeing the Mercians rise under the brilliant general Penda the Strong, just kills kings, conquers everybody, but he doesn't. It's so amazing. His reign is so strange because he defeats so many kings and defeats so many enemies, but doesn't go into the business of conquest. He defeats them and then returns to his own borders. But by 661, you see his children, they've taken over Sussex. You see the twin rulers of Essex are swearing allegiance. And really, 666 for me is the year where it all comes together, because you see King Wulfira granting the title of Bishop of London to Bishop Wine, who just escaped Wessex. Bishop said of London, who is an itinerant bishop, died of plague, and it's the Mercian kings granting the bishopric to somebody, and that for me, even though there's no specific date. I mean, I'm sounding very authoritative. There's lots of debate about this going on, but for me, it was here in 666. You start then seeing by the 730s, Aethelbald of Mercia, the king, he's granting the Bishop of London the rights to a ship and the taxation on the ship. And even though this is the 730s, what we have now in the Wick is we have a system of tithes, we have a system of tax collection, we have a legal system monitoring it, all mentioned in documentation. So by the 730s, definitely, and also that's the same decade we start seeing the first coins, the sciata. You really do get the feeling that because it was effectively the principal port of Mercia, it then starts becoming an emporium, and you start seeing, especially going into Offa, an explosion in the Wick as it becomes genuinely one of the most important trading ports in fact, the most important trading port of the islands under Offa, and the Mercian Emporium is what put Londonwic on the map, put London on the map, actually.
So that kind of takes us up into the period of the Heptarchy and the rule of the 7 different kingdoms, where you've got Mercia and Wessex and East Anglia, and I'm going to forget all the rest of them, Northumbria, and so
Two
on.
Northumbrias, yeah. It gets confusing.
So that's, for those of you all who are listening and aren't familiar, that's kind of the period in between the collapse of Roman rule, the creation and consolidation of states not just tribal networks or individuals. And the slow consolidation then of these kind of proto states into, like I said, Northumbria and Wessex and East Anglia and so on, that culminates with the arrival of large Scandinavian
Yeah,
forces, the
yeah,
Viking
that's
Age.
kind of the end of it.
Yeah, and can you tell us a little bit what happens to London? So we go from, you've got Mercia and Wessex and so on, and then a bunch of Scandinavians show up.
Yeah,
What happens next?
it's really interesting because if you look at it, we have this thing I sometimes feel as we go, oh, here come the Scandinavians, and we go into this whole idea of raid and despoilment. I One of the things I do with the podcast, I actually spent two whole episodes um, going on about the fact that London quite liked these guys when they first showed up, and there was a lot of reason why they should like them. Because when the Scandinavians showed up, they didn't always raid. They did usually one of four things. The first thing they did was trade. But if they suddenly realized they could get more money out of raiding, then they'd go a Viking. If they couldn't trade and they couldn't go Viking, they'd usually say, "Do you want some mercs?" And they'd mercenary. And if they couldn't do those three, and there was nobody around to stop them, then they'd go, "It's free real estate," and they'll settle. And what you start seeing is Mercia under Offa, and then his son Senwolf is incredibly powerful. And it's one of the ironies of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that they only mention Offa four times. Like you can see Wessex kind of grumbling as he completely dominates the land. And there's a beautiful bit. There's a Muslim historian in Isfahan, a Muslim geographer in Isfahan, Ibn Rashid, and he wrote the Book of Precious Things, which is a atlas to the world, really, and a guide to all the world. And he does a whole guide to the Dar es Islam, and then there's a guide to the lands of war, the barbarian lands. And he refers to, and this is a few centuries later, but he refers to an island far to the north with 7 kingdoms upon it, and a trade emporium that trades with all the world, which is Venerable Bede's words, a great emporium. And so under Offa, and Mercia's London was heard about in Isfahan. It was a staggeringly rich place. And during this period, before the Vikings turn up, and even after the Vikings and the Scandinavians turn up, you start seeing and the only way to describe it is an explosion in wealth. The amount of silver coins and gold coins produced under Offa. And one of the things that made London important was the Mercians had 2 mints. One was in Oxford, the second one was in London, and London was by way and by far the more important. And these mints are, the state is getting so much bullion in, they're producing it. If you look at surveys of coins, the explosion of coins produced by Offa. And just to tie in that link with Isfahan, my favourite coin of all the archaeological finds to do with London was round about Offa's reign. You have the kind of default recognised currency of choice for everybody was Muslim dinars, because they were produced in gold and they were high quality. They're coming out the caliphates and they're amazing. And Offa clearly had seen these, and so he commissioned a gold coin. And when you see it, it's quite amazing because it's an Anglo-Saxon coin covered in Arabic script, as he tried to copy the design features of the Caliphate dinar. Now, unfortunately, the moneyer who made it didn't speak a word of Arabic, so rather than saying there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet, it says nothing. But it is a copy, it's an attempt at a Caliphate dinar. And on the other side, there's the word Offa Rex. And this is where you start seeing when Mercia then starts, after Cenwulf, it then starts declining. You see the rise of Egbert of Wessex, and Wessex starts taking over. This sheer amount of money and coming into London continues. And this was based on, simply put, an extraordinarily good balance of trade. When you look at the amount of gold and silver in Anglo-Saxon England, and you start looking at, what could be pulled from the ground, and it was way beyond anything that the islands were capable of. It was being imported in, and awkwardly, what was England exporting at this time? What were the Seven Kingdoms exporting at this time in large numbers that generated such a balance of trade? Wool was definitely there, but I think the unspoken produce was humans. It was a slaving states, and they were very, very good at slaving, and they would sell slaves far and wide. There's trade concessions from this era down in Pavia on the borders of the Holy Roman Empire. And Pavia was a great choice because that was the one place Venice was allowed to trade in the Holy Roman Empire. And English merchants would sail out of Londominium or Ludunwic, go to Cologne, go down the Rhine, cross the Alps, and sell humans for huge amounts of money. And so it was such a trading emporium that roundabout, answering your question, when you start seeing it gets towards the 770s, 780s, as the Norse and the Scandinavians begin trading, they want part of this, so they become very good customers. And then roundabout, 790, we start seeing the first attacks going on and Lindisfarne. But it's worth noting whenever monks wrote down the attack upon Lindisfarne because it was fellow monks who happened to be on fire at the time. There probably were attacks going on beforehand. We know Offa was the height of Mercia. Offa was able to take over Kent, and Kent was probably being run down due to pirate attacks by Scandinavians, and so he was able to expand his influence. And so you have this crazy moment where, for a while, Mercia and Mercia's Ludunwic got on with them because they daren't attack. And part of the things you actually see going on in the early Viking attacks is they do a few years where they kind of attack everywhere, but then you see Charlemagne step up his defenses. You see Britannia step up its defenses. Offa talks about build bridges. That's what stops them because they can't sail shallow hold ships up the river. So build bridges. We know how to deal with them. And so you see from hoard remains in Scandinavia that the cycle of attack actually started focusing towards Scotland and the Irish Sea. The other incentive was if you went and raided somewhere like Ludunwic, if you did, and then sailed back, what was happening, unfortunately, for a lot of the early Vikings, if we'll call them that, was that Danish merchants were going, for God's sake, they're attacking our customers. And we do have letters, I think one of the kings of Denmark writes to one of the Holy Roman Emperor and says, oh, by the way, I killed those raiders who attacked your town. Sorry about that. So there was a real sense of, if you were going to attack, you went to somewhere where there wasn't trade. So that's why Scotland and Ireland and the Irish Sea got it so bad. And how did London treat the Vikings for a generation, from about 9 up until 830? So for about 40 years. I call them Odin's fashionistas, because you got Alcuin's letter just after the raid where he's like so irate. He's sitting over in the court of Charlemagne and he's writing back and he's like, why are people emulating these foreigners in their style of dress and their haircuts and their belt buckles? He's so angry that this has brought sin upon England because they're emulating how they dress and how they look. And you do get the idea they come across far more as fashionistas. And then there's a lovely incident around about 810 where a papal legate called Eardwulf is sailing across the Atlantic on business. He'd come to visit Northumbria, and he was sailing back, and he got kidnapped by a bunch of Vikings. And you see a papal letter going, I'm pretty sure it was to offer to one of the other kings, saying, thank you so much, because what happened was in Ludunwic, somebody went, oh, has he been kidnapped? We know a guy, because there were Danish merchants who knew a friend who knew a friend. And the whole negotiation of his release took place with Mercians in London, getting this papal legate, yeah, here's his ransom, we'll sort it out. So right up until the reign of Burgred, right up until, I'd say, the 940s, 840s, sorry, you've got a working relationship. These people are not the enemy. They're attacking everybody else. They'll never attack us. And then with 840, with the decline in trade everywhere, and there wasn't the merchants going, these are our customers, that you begin to see the change, and you begin to see the first raids, and that led to a small attack in 851, and then a very large attack in 841, and then a very large attack in 851 that also saw the Mercian king Brithnov taken out by the Vikings. And that was the big change, 851. At that point, the Vikings are the enemy.
Well, when we're looking at that, that's a good bridging point, because I know later on in this time period, London served as something of a center of resistance to a lot of Scandinavian invaders. I believe it is Sweyn Forkbeard and Canute besiege the city but don't actually take it. And that there's a lot of resistance. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my whole thing is, I think 851, looking at that attack at 851, and we know it was bad because the mint stopped producing. It just stopped. And that's probably the only time you see it stop producing, because obviously the bullion had been stolen. And Ludunwic, for all its commerce and all its wealth, was not a well-defended place. It had a small ditch. It wasn't anywhere you would want to defend. So that was probably the worst thing that happened to it and caused a lot of trauma. Population starts diminishing. It starts going the kind of way that Londominium was looking like it was going to go, in terms of just decline. But then it started coming under the influence of Wessex, and Burgred, who becomes king of Mercia, only has power because Wessex will back him.
Before we go on, we're talking about the population of Ludunwic, London, whatever. What number are we looking at here? Because obviously, in the aftermath of Roman rule, most large-scale urban centers in Europe got a lot smaller. Rome goes from 1 million people in the first century to a few tens of thousands by the 5th, 6th century. So when we're looking at the actual population in the city, what number are we looking at here?
Ludwig, I don't think ever got beyond 11,000 ever, and I think it was smaller. I'd say somewhere between 7 to 11, maybe. I'd give it up to 7 at its height. But for its time and its place, that's pretty darn big.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's still obviously the biggest city in the British Isles at this point.
Yeah, I think it was the biggest emporium, and compared to the likes of the other big places like, political places like Winchester or Rochester or Canterbury, it was huge. But we are still talking village size by our standards, town size by our standards, small town. But to go back to the point, what happened is that it managed to avoid a lot of the initial onslaught of the Great Heathen Army. And I go into enormous detail looking at the latest research that's coming out of it, that Great Heathen Army was not led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. Ragnar Lothbrok being the Viking equivalent of King Arthur. Put him away. He's not real. But what actually happened was my whole theory, and I've had this theory for a long time based on other work I've done about the Norse diaspora of the Irish Sea. The Great Heathen Army didn't come from Scandinavia. The mainstay of the Great Heathen Army came from the Irish Sea, where there had been now for over a generation a growing diaspora of what we now call the Norse Gaels. They were Norse, they settled, and they married in. And they married into communities in the Isle of Wight, the Scottish Isles, west coast of Scotland, and in Ireland. And they produced what was ostensibly a totally Scandinavian culture, but also totally rejected Scandinavian culture. They didn't have polygamy. And above all, they elected their leaders. And this was there was no hereditary titles. Leaders were chosen. And I think the theory I picked up from several historians, it was a hierarchy. It was a bit like, crews chose their captains, captains chose to align with one another, and it allowed joint operations to grow and grow and grow. And when the Great Heathen Army turned up, it wasn't an army, it was a horde, it was a whole invasion. And their whole purpose was to take Jorvik, to take York. And take what you can, but if you can take York and link it to Dublin, you now have Route 1 to the rest of the Scandinavian world without having to go via the Scottish Isles or go around the Cornish coast. So this was the mainstay of those attacks. And for the longest time, because of its location, Ludunwic avoided this. The closest it came to it was after the year of 9 battles, where effectively what's done is Alfred's brother, and Alfred he gives a Dane guild to the Great Heathen Army, please stop attacking me. And they winter in London, in Ludunwic, but they don't raid the place. In fact, they make some coins for Halfton Whitechurch. I went to Ludunwic and all I got was these commemorative coins. And so they occupy Ludunwic. And so this kind of situation goes on, and it's only after Alfred takes over that they move the population of Ludunwic behind the walls of the city. And that really important moment in 886, where he does specifically move the population behind that, because it's a burh, it's a fortress with the best walls in England. But almost immediately you start seeing, as I describe it, the kind of the sheep of Ludunwic become the wolves of London burh. And at that point, they become incredible. The Fjord of London is ferocious. They make war and they kill and they enslave and they burn. And it never fell. Throughout the entire Viking Age, nobody took it. And there were some big battles. And London held firm. And to the point of Sven Forkbeard invaded England 3 times. First time, the first thing he does is sail straight up the Thames to go for this rich city. Has his ass handed to him, mainly because he didn't plan for a bridge to be there. And then on his second time, he avoids London altogether. And on the third time, when he actually does win, he actually tries to avoid London. That first battle was such a trauma for him that he only attacks London when he's got nowhere else, because Aethelred's taken a last stand in London. He has to go to London and has his ass handed to him again. And then Canute could never take it, and he besieged it, and he tried so much. But you see it happen. The Jomsvikings, one of the things I picked up in doing my research, the Jomsvikings, who under Thorkild the Tall took everywhere. They defeated everyone. Not one part of the English fjord could defeat them, except for London, who almost sank their entire fleet, forced Thorkild and the Jomsvikings to conduct operations on foot, where they're reduced to infantry and are terrified of London and its fleet. The moment where Edmund Ironsides summons the Fjord, and the Fjord turns to Edmund Ironsides and says, "We will not fight unless London comes." So it became a city of wolves during the wars with the Scandinavians, and that's really noticeable, just how militant it became and ruthless. And and splendid to chronicle, I can tell.
Well, so that kind of bridges the gap then between the Heptarchy period and then the period of Scandinavian incursion. And then, for those of us who are not as familiar with English medieval history, we see the consolidation of an actual English kingdom, the Kingdom of England, with the rise of Wessex. So, can you walk us through a little bit about what does the rise of Wessex mean for the development of London, and where does London sit then, kind of in this period of conflict between the Danes and the English, the the contests between the kings of Wessex, later England, the kings of Denmark, and how England gets tossed around between different monarchs. What's London's role in all of this?
London is created by this. London as we know it, London birth. Alfred created a militarized state, the Burr system, the Fjord system. All men can be, for a set period of time, are expected to serve. All men. You are no more than 20 miles away from a reinforced redoubt. It was a state created, born out of the reality of sea-based, highly maneuverable enemies who will attack at any point. So this is where, when he created London, but it was part of that. It was part and parcel of his state. Where slight controversy, I don't know, it's a theory I've picked up from other historians, I will say it's not just mine, but I do subscribe to it, was the actual creation of London and the English state comes about, for me, the attack by Guthrum of the Great Heathen Army upon Alfred, where he wins. Alfred goes off, does this whole Rambo guerrilla campaign, comes back and he wins. The problem with that is Guthrum's attack on Alfred was his second attack. A year or so before he'd launched his first attack, which was meant to be a sea-based invasion of the south coast. And we know from the records, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that Guthrum lost a hell of a lot of ships. I'm trying to remember the exact number. I think it's something like 120 ships were sunk off the southern coast of England. At this point, the Great Heathen Army had split. Guthrum had the smaller bit. The larger bit had gone off with Halfdan to consolidate Jorvik and Dublin. They were fighting on the Irish Sea and fighting in Strathclyde. So he's got a smaller number of Vikings. He loses 120 ships. He never again launches a sea-based operation after this. He never gets a fleet. When he goes to attack Alfred the second time, we know the only ships that are involved were coming from the former leader, Uber, who did a pincer movement coming out of Dublin onto near the Bristol Channel, and unfortunately ran into a fjord where no fjord was expected to be, and Uber died. But the question is, where did he get the troops from? And the argument that's put forward is that, this great heathen army is called the Great Heathen Army because the term heathen doesn't describe nationality or religion, because when Guthrum invades, he's backed up by an awful lot of men from Mercia. Mercia joins in. It's a joint operation. And that makes sense because when Burgred was toppled, what you see was the Seerwolf, who later was told to be, he was just a puppet of the Vikings. Seerwolf actually came from one of the dynastic families of Mercia. Burgred didn't. The Great Heathen Army had wintered in Repton, but didn't despoil the place. They just set up base in Repton. The excavations show there was no despoiling. They had a nice fortress in Repton. And Repton was one of the dynastic headquarters of the rightful rulers of Mercia. And effectively, what we now think happened is a Great Heathen Army mercenaried for Seawolf because the only reason Burgred was in power is Wessex was backing him. So Ceolwulf said, well, I've got these Danes, and Burgred ran away. So Guthrum basically pulled in the favour. Ceolwulf joins in. When Ashenden happens and the war ends with Alfred victorious, what he then does is he annexes southern Mercia. And rather than describing his kingdom as Wessex, you then start seeing very specifically Alfred taking Bede's idea of one nation and politicizing it and producing the word Anglesey, the Anglekind, the English. And it's that Anglesey mentality that he then drives forward. There's a very confusing moment between that, and there's a fight that takes place where at the end of the decade, where it looks like Guthrum breaks the treaty and there's fighting between Wessex and Essex, Kent and Essex, and it's really, really bad. And maybe the actual borders between the Danelaw and England were established not when Alfred took over, but towards the end of the decade. But it's in light of that in 886, after the breakdown, that Alfred then gets very militant and he places a burh 3 miles from the declared border with the Danelaw, and that is London. And so from the word go, it was created as a fortress, and that infects it all the way through. And so you start seeing right the way through every invasion, every attack, all the expansions, they push on as part of this Anglesey identity. But the lovely irony is, for me, was he always knew Ludunwic was a Mercian town, which is why when Alfred took over, he appoints the only Lord of London, Aethelred of Mercia, his son-in-law, who gets to be the Lord of London for his lifetime, and upon his death, the title of Lord of London will revert to the crown. And it's so interesting when he moves London over to London Burg, the very first thing he does is he puts a Mercian in charge. And one of the side effects of that going in is because it's a Mercian in charge, what happens behind those walls is a distribution of land that is far more Mercian in nature than Wessexian. And Aethelred of Mercia basically divides everything up into souks, little plots of land which people can buy and people can invest in and people can live in, and it's all self-running. And the souks of London become the wards of the city of London at a later date, and it starts then having a Mercian in charge, and he runs it. And some of the early campaigns are driven by Aethelred of Mercia. Big fight against a particular Viking warlord called Haston is led by him, and you know they are within a few years, within 10 years, militant and attacking.
And what's the situation then in London after Alfred? So after we have the creation of this fortified burh and we see the consolidation of England into a more centralized, durable state, how does London start to pull away from the other parts of England? I mean, because we've got
It doesn't at first. It doesn't at first. For the longest time, it's you know it's not the largest town after it moves behind the walls. And in terms of political importance, Canterbury, Winchester, and York are more important than it. The early town, you start seeing things like West Seep or Cheapside and East Seep or East Cheap is born, earliest Pudding Lane, earliest Milks Lane, that kind of thing. What you start seeing is it starts becoming far more, the militancy of the place starts being seen and how they treat their neighbours. There's a wonderful thing that starts up around about the 900s called the Peace Guard. The Peace Guard is basically a vigilante force. If you stole from London or from the Londoners would form a huge posse in their hundreds, go out, find you, and kill you. There's no messing about with it. And you know, the only impact from the state was, you know, you see one king turn around and say, you kill everybody over 12. That's a little harsh. Wait till they're 15, and then there's like, oh, okay. But it was so weird because that actually became the first, almost the Peace Guild becomes the first, I don't know, organising committee of London. We have two guys, a man called Elphiestib and Brithnos, son of Odder, and they were summoned to Athelstan. They're the first two London representatives. Really, where London begins to change is during the reign of Athelstan. And that's partly because Athelstan was detested in Wessex. And even though he was this great king, he conquered everything, Wessex did not like him, and he did not like Wessex. He'd been raised in Mercia. Surprise, surprise. You know, Mercia, I think I said at one point in the podcast, Mercia is like Schrodinger's state. It doesn't exist yet. It still continuously does exist all through this era. And what Athelstan did that helped London was he changed the way England was run as it expanded, as it grew. You know, up until Athelstan, you needed the king would travel around his lands to hold court. Athelstan couldn't do that. He just conquered vast amounts of the north. He spent most of his reign in the north trying to hold it down. So he created law codes. That's why Athelstan became the great lawgiver. And you see in London at this time, now there is no Lord of London. London began to identify with its bishops. And I think it's Theodred. Yeah, Theodred. Theodred was a Germanic bishop who was advisor to Athelstan, and London loved him, and he helped create this different state, this newly expanded state, and London's right in the middle, capitalizing from this. They started getting rights to, as they started trading again, and trade picked up a lot, back to Mercian levels almost. They started getting rights from that, and they started to, you know, Londoners, that mentality, foreigners begin at the walls begins, and so they defend their businesses and they do. So Athelstan really was the change, and then that was followed up by, you know, very high profile bishops. So you've got, after them you've got Wulfstan, who becomes, you know, Archbishop Wulfstan of York. People forget he was Bishop of London for 2 years. You've got Dunstan, was St. Dunstan was Bishop of London before he became Archbishop of Canterbury. So London gets a series of high profile bishops that raise its profile and raise its influence and its say, and that goes right the way through. And you see that Athelstan very much so. Edgar was very, very supportive of London and of him. But so as it goes on towards Athelstan, you start seeing London grow in importance and prominence and wealth.
So as we see that period of its growth and this kind of association with the church, where does that leave London on the eve of the Norman conquest? So if we're going to look at the city of London in the early 11th century, so you know the generation after Wulfstan and Canute and the kind of the end of the major Scandinavian interventions into Britain, even though they obviously didn't know it at the time. What does London look like?
London's totally changed because that Scandinavian intervention had been profound. They resisted Canute. They resisted him to his dying day until, you know, when Edmund Ironside surrendered and surrendered London too. It was like, and they did what they learned then what they always knew: when you resist the king, pay them off and they'll forgive you. And so they did. And we've tried to introduce and came very close to succeeding to introduce a greater Scandinavian culture. And within England, you start seeing an Anglo-Dane culture. And, you know, you have that. You've got Canute, you've got Harold I, you've got Hafr-Canute, and they're all foreign invaders. They're all Danish. He'd occupied the city with 40 ships who were based in Lambeth. And they settled, and the Anglo-Danes who settled there married in. You see them; they were the ones who chose Harold I, against Godwin, who was their nominal champion. There's another Anglo-Dane, Godwin and his bunch. And so London is very much a place where the Anglo-Danes were in charge. And I mean, the death of Harthacnut was at a wedding in Lambeth, which was where the fleets were based. Lambeth was owned by Godwin. You know, Lambeth Southwark was very much the Anglo-Danish enclave. Osgood Clapper and Tovey Pruder, leading members of Canut's community. They'd come up again in Harthacnut because he didn't trust any of the locals. Big wedding in Lambeth. Harthacnut drops dead, and then the Anglo-Norman Edward the Confessor, takes over with Anglo-Danish support, marries Edith. And so when you're coming up to the Norman conquest, London is a place with a massive Anglo-Danish community. I mean, at one point under Harthacnut, there were 90-odd ships in Southwark. Edward got that down to zero and then tried to take out the Godwins. Complete chaos in that one. England was suffering because Harold Godwinson was inept, and he was pushing the Godwinsons to remove all power. So, you know, he'd endless wars with the Earl of Mercia, which he kept losing. Genocidal campaigns in Wales. When his family's exiled, he joins the Vikings in Dublin, does slaving raids. You know, venal, awful man. And he left it so that the state was weakened. But the whole point was, as we're getting to the Norman conquest, despite the deprivations of the Vikings, and they had, the Danes had crippled London and Britain, it's still a very strong state. It's at peace with all its neighbours. And as you're going towards the end of 1065, it's a thriving, multicultural society. You've got London, which is supposedly Anglo-Saxon. South London is all Anglo-Dane. Danish traders have their own community living in the city. You've got a Norman Bishop of London. The king is surrounded by his Normans who he grew up with. You've got Harold Godwinson and his Anglo-Danes in charge of Anglo-Saxons. Very cosmopolitan kind of society. But that all changes in 1066.
I think we're going to go ahead and stop there, at least for right now, because we're getting on to almost an hour long, and I'm sure there's a lot more to talk about when it comes to medieval London. So what we're going to do is we'll put a pin in this right here, and we'll have to pick up this discussion at a later time where we can talk about what happens to London after the Norman conquest and what the next several decades and centuries of London look like after the entire political structure of England is completely overthrown.
I'd love to. Thank you. And thank you for letting me talk about it. I mean, the thing about the podcast is I really enjoy doing it because I love talking about London history, but doing something like this just allows me to step back and take an overview as opposed to looking at just a few years at a time. And it's just a fascinating, I find anyway, fascinating story, the story of London. So thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.